In the crisp autumn of 1939, as the leaves turned gold across the vast Canadian landscape from the Rockies to the Maritimes, a shadow fell over the world. Nazi Germany had invaded Poland, and Britain, along with France, declared war. But Canada, that quiet northern neighbor often seen by Americans as a land of polite Mounties, endless forests, and hockey rinks, made a bold move. On September 10th, just a week after Britain, the Canadian Parliament gathered in Ottawa under Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King. They debated not as a mere dominion, but as a sovereign nation. And they chose war independently. No automatic tie to the crown compelled them. It was a deliberate act of defiance against tyranny. Over 1 million Canadians would eventually serve, from farmers in Saskatchewan to fishermen in Newfoundland, volunteering in droves without the draft that gripped other nations. Yet, south of the border, in the bustling cities of New York and Chicago, where newspapers like the New York Times splashed headlines of European chaos, Canada barely registered as a player. Americans, still clinging to isolationism under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, viewed their northern ally through a lens of benign neglect. They're just part of the British Empire, many muttered over coffee, dismissing Canadian efforts as extensions of London's reach. Canadian soldiers were lumped in as British troops, their ships as part of the Royal Navy, and their pilots under the RAF banner. It was an easy oversight for a nation of 130 million, gazing at a country of just 11 million souls. But this misjudgment ran deep, rooted in history. The War of 1812's failed invasions had left a scar, but by the 20th century, Canada was seen as the peaceable kingdom, good for timber, wheat, and perhaps a vacation spot, but not a military powerhouse. As the war escalated, Canada's mobilization was swift and profound. Factories in Toronto and Montreal hummed with urgency, converting automobile plants into tank assembly lines and shipyards expanding to churn out corvettes and destroyers. The Royal Canadian Navy, starting from a handful of vessels, ballooned to over 700 ships and 95,000 sailors by war's end. They patrolled the treacherous North Atlantic, escorting convoys laden with supplies to Britain, vital lifelines against U-boat wolf packs. Canadian airmen established the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, a massive program that turned prairies into airfields, training over 130,000 pilots and crew from across the Allies. It cost Canada billions, but it forged the sky's defenders. Americans, watching from afar, underestimated this grit. In Washington, military planners whispered that Canadian forces were green and untested, lacking the scale or experience of a true great power. Roosevelt's administration focused on Lend-Lease aid to Britain and the Soviets, conveniently overlooking that Canada received none of it, yet provided billions in mutual aid to the Allies, including the U.S. itself. Canadian economists and industrialists worked tirelessly, integrating their output into American supply chains without fanfare. Munitions, aircraft, and vehicles rolled south, but the narrative remained. Canada was a supplier, not a strategist. The first cracks in this perception appeared in the Pacific. On December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, Canada declared war on Japan, beating the U.S. by hours. 2 battalions, the Winnipeg Grenadiers and the Royal Rifles of Canada, were already in Hong Kong, sent to bolster British defenses. These men, many from small prairie towns, faced overwhelming Japanese forces. For 17 days, they fought in brutal urban combat, hill-to-hill, bayonet charges in the rain-soaked darkness. Outnumbered and under-equipped, they held lines against artillery and infantry assaults. Private John Gray from Nova Scotia later recounted hiding in foxholes as bombs fell, whispering prayers amid the chaos. But Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day, with over 550 Canadians killed or wounded, and the survivors enduring horrific POW camps. American headlines barely noted it, folding the story into British defeats. Yet, this baptism by fire hardened Canadian resolve, teaching lessons in resilience that would echo later. Meanwhile, in Europe, Canadian troops arrived in Britain as early as 1939, training rigorously while the U.S. debated neutrality. By 1942, with America now in the war, joint planning began. But American commanders, fresh from their own rapid buildup, often viewed Canadians as secondary. In secret memos, some U.S. generals noted the limited experience of Canadian divisions, assuming they needed handholding. This underestimation would be tested at Dieppe. August 19, 1942, Operation Jubilee. Over 6,000 troops, mostly Canadian from the 2nd Infantry Division, stormed the French port of Dieppe. It was meant as a raid to probe German defenses, gather intelligence, and boost morale. But from the outset, it was a gamble. American Rangers joined, but the bulk was Canadian, men like those from the Essex Scottish Regiment charging pebble beaches under withering machine gun fire from cliffs. Tanks bogged down on the shingle, radios failed in the smoke, and Luftwaffe bombers strafed the landing craft. Within hours, it was a bloodbath. 3,367 Canadians casualties, including 907 killed. Survivors like Sergeant Major Lucien Dumais swam back to ships under fire, dragging wounded comrades. Americans observed from afar, some shaking their heads at the failure. Media in the U.S. portrayed it as a British blunder, barely acknowledging the Canadian sacrifice. But Dieppe wasn't just a defeat, it was a classroom. Lessons learned there shaped D-Day. The need for better air support, specialized landing craft, and overwhelming firepower. Canadian generals like Guy Simonds internalized these, vowing to adapt. Yet, the misjudgment persisted. As Allied forces prepared for invasions in Sicily and Italy, U.S. planners assigned Canadians to flank roles, assuming they couldn't lead assaults. Little did they know, the battlefield would reveal truths that headlines ignored. In the rugged hills of Sicily, Canadian troops would march into the fray, their steady advance surprising even their American allies. But as the sun set on 1942, with the world teetering, a greater test loomed, one that would force America to reckon with the underestimated giant to its north. What happened next would rewrite alliances and forge unbreakable bonds in fire and blood. By the summer of 1943, the tide was turning, but slowly. The snow still clung to the Manitoba fields when the men of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division and the 1st Canadian Armour Brigade boarded ships in Scotland bound for the sun-baked island of Sicily. Operation Husky, the invasion of Italy, was the largest amphibious assault in history up to that point, dwarfing even the later Normandy landings in the number of divisions committed on the first day. The Americans under General George Patton and the British under Montgomery were the loud names, the ones the newspapers loved. The Canadians? They were tucked in on the left flank of the British 8th Army, quietly told to keep up and protect the open side. What the American planners did not fully grasp was that these were no longer the eager but green troops of 1939 to 42. These were veterans who had trained for 4 long years in Britain, who had absorbed every bitter lesson from Dieppe, and who marched with a quiet fury. On July 10, 1943, under a moonless sky, the assault craft grated onto the coarse sand at Juno Beach. The Royal Canadian Regiment and the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment leapt out into waist-deep water, expecting slaughter. Instead, they met confused Italian coastal troops who surrendered almost before the first shot. Within hours, the Canadians had taken their objectives and were pushing inland faster than any other formation on the beachhead. Patton, racing for glory in headlines, sent furious messages to Alexander's headquarters. Who the hell are these Canadians and why are they outpacing my 7th Army? The answer came in the days that followed. Through blistering heat and choking dust, the Canadians drove north along the coastal road toward the Semedo River. At Grand Michel, Leon Forte, Osoro, and Agira, they fought a series of savage little battles that military historians still study. At Osoro, the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry scaled a 900-foot cliff in the dead of night, straight up a goat path the Germans considered impossible, then surprised the defenders at dawn. The Germans broke and ran. American war correspondents trailing Patton's columns began to notice. These khaki-clad men with the red shoulder patches weren't just holding the flank. They were winning the race to Messina. But the real shock came in the mountains of central Sicily. The Germans rushed the battle-hardened 1st Parachute Division and the Hermann Göring Panzer Division to block the Allied advance. At the town of Agira, the Canadians attacked again and again into fortified ridges. The Edmonton Regiment lost almost every officer in one 48-hour period yet refused to yield ground. When it was over, the road to Catania lay open. An astonished Montgomery wrote in his diary, The Canadians have fought magnificently. I do not believe any troops in the world could have done better. Even Patton, never generous with praise, admitted privately that he had misjudged the boys from the Dominion. By the time Sicily fell on August 17th, the Canadians had marched 150 miles in 38 days, taken 85,000 prisoners, and suffered 2,300 casualties, proportionally higher than any other Allied formation. And yet, when the newsreels played in American theaters, it was Patton slapping a soldier or Montgomery puffing his pipe that filled the screen. The Canadian story was a footnote, if it appeared at all. The pattern repeated itself when the Allies crossed to the Italian mainland in September 1943. The British landed at Calabria, the Americans at Salerno, and the Canadians, again, were given the quiet sector across the Strait of Messina. Quiet lasted exactly 3 days. The moment the 1st Canadian Division set foot on the toe of Italy, the Germans counterattacked with everything they had. What followed was a brutal slog up the shinbone of Italy, Mata Montecavino, Potenza, the crossing of the Biferno River in pouring rain with makeshift bridges under shellfire. Each time the Canadians cracked the Gustav Line a little further, the American Fifth Army on their right found its own path east. The winter of 1943-44 brought the Canadians to the very gates of Ortona on the Adriatic coast. The town was a maze of narrow streets, rubble, and booby traps. The Germans turned every house into a fortress. What happened there from December 20th to 28th became known simply as the Canadian Stalingrad. The loyal Edmonton Regiment, the Seaforth Highlanders, and the Princess Patricias fought house by house, room by room, sometimes hurling grenades through holes blasted in shared walls, a technique the men grimly nicknamed mouse-holing. Tanks of the Three Rivers Regiment prowled the streets, firing point-blank into upper stories. By Christmas Day, the fighting was so close that both sides paused to sing carols across the rubble, then resumed killing each other at dawn. When Ortona finally fell, the cost was staggering: 1,375 Canadians dead in 8 days. German losses were even higher. A captured German officer told his interrogators, "We thought you were British colonial troops. We did not expect this." American correspondents who reached the ruined town weeks later were stunned into silence by the scale of destruction. Ernie Pyle wrote, "I have never seen anything like Ortona. These Canadians fought as if the future of the world depended on one little port." Yet still the old stereotypes lingered in Washington and New York newsrooms. Canada remained the helpful cousin, not the warrior. Even as Canadian destroyers escorted American convoys, Canadian factories built Valentine tanks for the U.S. Army, and Canadian pilots flew Boston bombers with American crews, the narrative refused to shift. Roosevelt himself, in a 1944 press conference, referred to Canada's effort as magnificent but then added, almost as an afterthought, "Of course, within the framework of the British Commonwealth." The room laughed politely. Few noticed the slight. But the greatest revelation was still to come. In the muddy fields of Normandy, in the closing of the Falaise Gap, and on the bloody road to the Rhine, the world, and America in particular, would finally be forced to see Canada for what she truly was: not a junior partner, not a polite supplier, but a nation that had paid in blood for every inch of ground and earned the right to stand shoulder to shoulder with any army on earth. The reckoning was only beginning. June 6, 1944. Juno Beach. The Americans had Omaha and Utah, the British had Golden Sword, and the Canadians drew Juno, 8 kilometers of sand, reefs, and concrete that the Germans had fortified harder than any other sector. American planners, studying the maps in London, quietly worried that the 3rd Canadian Division, many of its men still carrying the mental scars of Dieppe, might falter. General Omar Bradley later admitted he told Eisenhower, "If anyone cracks today, it will be the Canadians." Eisenhower said nothing. He simply nodded and moved on. At 7:45, the first landing craft of the Regina Rifles at the Royal Winnipeg Rifles dropped their ramps into chest-deep water. The men waded ashore under direct fire from 75mm and 88mm guns that had perfect enfilade down the beach. Houses along the seawall were bristling with machine guns. Yet within 20 minutes the Canadians were off the sand and into the streets of Courseulles-sur-Mer, Berniers, and St-Aubin. By noon they had pushed farther inland than any other Allied division that morning. The North Shore, New Brunswick Regiment cleared a massive strong point at Tailleville after hand-to-hand fighting in the cellars. The Queen's own rifles lost almost every officer in their lead companies but kept moving. A German regimental commander, watching through binoculars, radioed in disbelief, "The enemy on Juno are not stopping for anything." By nightfall, the Canadians had driven 10 kilometers inland and linked up with the British and American beachheads, something the Supreme Headquarters had not expected until D+3. An American liaison officer attached to Canadian headquarters sent a stunned message back to Bradley: "These people are not the same army we knew in England. They are fighting like tigers." The Summer of Normandy became a Canadian legend written in mud and blood. While American and British columns bogged down in the hedgerows, the Canadians were given the toughest assignments: clear camp from the north, take Carpiquet airfield, hold the eastern flank against every panzer division Hitler could throw into the meat grinder. Operation Goodwood, Operation Bluecoat, Operation Totalize. Again and again the orders read, "Canadians will attack." And they did. Verrières Ridge cost the Black Watch 315 men in a single morning. The Calgary Highlanders and the Maisonneuves bled themselves white at St-André-sur-Orne. Yet every time the line bent, it never broke. Then came Totalize and Tractable, the night attacks with searchlights bouncing off clouds to create artificial moonlight, a Canadian innovation that stunned the Germans and allowed armor to advance through darkness. The climax came in August at the Falaise Gap. Hitler had ordered his armies in Normandy to stand fast, and now they were trapped. The Canadians, spearheaded by the 4th Armored Division and the Polish 1st Armored, drove south from Trun and Chambois to close the pocket. For 4 days the road from Falaise to Argenton was a shooting gallery. Canadian Typhoons with rocket pods, Sherman Fireflies with 17-pounders, and infantry riding on the tanks poured fire into the chaos. A German staff officer who escaped wrote later, "We feared the British bombing, we respected the American artillery, but the Canadians, they came at us like wolves and would not stop." When the gap finally slammed shut on August 21st, over 50,000 Germans were captured and another 10,000 lay dead in the fields. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army had ceased to exist as fighting forces. General Dwight Eisenhower walked the battlefield a few days later, looked at the burned-out tanks and swollen bodies as far as the eye could see, and said quietly to his aide, "I want to meet the Canadian commander who did this." He was told it was General Guy Simonds, 39 years old, soft-spoken, chain-smoking. Eisenhower shook his hand and said simply, "You've shortened the war by months." Yet when Eisenhower gave his victory statement to the press, he spoke of American, British, and Free French valor. Canada was mentioned once, almost in passing. The old habit died hard. The final awakening came in 1945 during the Rhineland Campaign and the liberation of the Netherlands. The Canadian First Army, now 200,000 strong under General Harry Crerar, cleared the Scheldt estuary in one of the most savage amphibious battles of the war, opening Antwerp to Allied shipping when every other port was still in ruins. Then they fought through the Reichswald forest, flooded fields, and fortified towns all the way to the North Sea, freeing city after city while the Dutch people starved under German occupation. When Canadian troops entered Apeldoorn, Utrecht, and Amsterdam, they were greeted not just as liberators but as saviors. To this day, Dutch schoolchildren lay flowers on Canadian graves every spring. By May 1945, Canada had suffered 45,000 killed, proportionally higher than the United States. The Royal Canadian Navy had become the third largest in the world. Canadian factories had built 16,000 aircraft, 800,000 trucks, and half the Allied shipping tonnage in the last 2 years of war. And still, in many American minds, Canada remained the polite neighbor who sent raw materials. But the men who fought beside them knew better. American veterans of the Falaise Gap told their children, "Never underestimate a Canadian." George Patton, before he died, wrote a private note that was found years later. "Had I had 3 more divisions like the Canadian First Army, the war would have ended in 1944. So here is the truth your fathers and grandfathers carried home quietly, without boast or demand for recognition. Canada was never the junior partner. She was the steady hand on the wheel when others wavered, the nation that paid the highest price per capita of any Allied country, the one that turned American doubt into awe on battlefield after battlefield. They thought we were polite, peaceful, and small. They learned, too late for the headlines but in time for victory, that maple leaves can hide steel. And that, my friends, is the story America never quite told, but one we must never forget. Lest we forget. The guns fell silent on May 8, 1945, and the boys began to come home. They stepped off the trains in Halifax, Montreal, Winnipeg, Vancouver, thin, sunburned or pale, eyes older than their years, carrying duffel bags and memories they would spend a lifetime trying to explain. At the docks in Halifax, mothers searched faces for sons who would never appear. In small towns across the prairies, church bells rang for the same day the telegrams stopped arriving. In the United States, the victory parades were loud and long. New York threw the biggest party the world had ever seen. Ticker-tape blizzards buried Fifth Avenue while Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley waved from open cars. In Washington, President Truman spoke of the American century just beginning. Canada had its own parades, quieter, smaller, proud in the way a family is proud when no one else is watching. On Parliament Hill, Mackenzie King spoke of sacrifice and duty, then went home to his diary and wrote that he feared history would forget what Canada had done. He was right to be proven half right and half wrong. For a generation, the American story of the war was told in Technicolor, Saving Private Ryan before the film even existed. The Canadians appeared, if at all, as polite voices on the radio or khaki figures in the background of newsreels. School textbooks south of the border gave Canada a paragraph, maybe two. Canada contributed significantly to the Allied victory, they said, the same way they noted that Brazil sent a division and Iceland provided weather stations. Polite applause, then back to Normandy, Iwo Jima, and the Bulge. But the men who had actually been there never forgot. In the 1950s and 60s, when American and Canadian veterans gathered at reunions, the stories poured out over beer and rye. A former U.S. paratrooper from the 101st Airborne would slap a C-4th Highlander on the back and say, "You bastards at Boron, you saved our asses when the 12th SS came through." An ex-tank commander from Patton's 3rd Army would buy rounds for the Sherbrooke Fusiliers and growl, "Falaise. Jesus Christ, Falaise. You close that pocket like a steel trap." They remembered. They just couldn't forget. Slowly, the truth leaked out in books most Americans never read. Farley Mowat's and No Bird Sang. Tony German's The Sea is at Our Gates. The regimental history stacked in Legion halls from Victoria to St. John's. Serious historians, American ones, even, began to notice. In 1984, Carlo Dess published Decision in Normandy and wrote bluntly, "The Canadians fought a series of battles in the Cannes sector that were as brutal as any on the Western Front, and they won them." In 1994, Max Hastings, an overlord, admitted that the Canadian Army's performance from D-Day to the Scheldt was outstanding by any standards. Yet the popular image lagged behind. It took the 1998 miniseries Band of Brothers, beloved and brilliant, to accidentally reveal the gap. American audiences watched Episode 9, Why We Fight, and saw a Canadian Army truck convoy rolling through the snow, soldiers handing out food to starving civilians. Comments flooded early internet forums. "Who are those guys with the red patches? I thought Canada didn't really fight." The producers hadn't meant to start conversation. They simply filmed what happened. But thousands of Canadians, young and old, flooded message boards with quiet fury and pride. Something shifted after that. YouTube arrived. Veterans' children and grandchildren began uploading grainy footage. The assault on Juno, the house-to-house nightmare of Ortona, the liberation parades in Dutch streets where people wept and kissed the mud on Canadian boots. Views climbed into the millions. Comments from American veterans' families appeared. "My dad always said the Canadians were the toughest sons of bitches he ever saw. Now I understand why." In 2019, on the 75th anniversary of D-Day, the U.S. network NBC sent a crew to Juno Beach for the first time in decades. The reporters stood among the maple leaf flags and said, on air, "For years we told the story of 5 beaches. The truth is there were 6. The clip went viral. Canadian Legion branches reported their highest membership surge in 50 years. And still the deepest recognition came in the smallest moments. And a 98-year-old American veteran in Florida, bedridden, asked his nurse to find that Canadian kid who pulled me out of a ditch near Cannon 44. They found him, living in Regina, same age, same limp. They arranged a video call. The American cried first. "I never got to buy you that beer, John." The Canadian just smiled and said, "You'd have done the same, buddy. Hell, you did 2 weeks later." That is the real ending to the story America got wrong. They thought we were quiet because we were weak. They learned we were quiet because we had nothing to prove. They thought we followed. We simply chose the harder path and walked it without complaint. They thought our war was small. We know it was large enough to bury 45,000 of our best under foreign soil, and to keep the light burning for millions who would never know our names. So when someone today, maybe even one of our own grandchildren, says, "Did Canada really do much in the war?" you can smile the way your father or grandfather smiled, quiet and certain, and answer, "We did enough. We did more than enough." And the men who stood beside us in the mud and the blood and the fire, they never forgot it. That's all the recognition a Canadian ever needed. Lest we forget. And now, my friends, we never will.